Thank you guys very much. We have with us, as promised, our co-directors, Frank Saraceno, William Weinbaum, and David Seronick. Gentlemen, thank you very much. So we're going to talk for a little while, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience, if I can see you. I mentioned before we rolled the film that there have been a lot of treatments, obviously, over the last 20 years, documentaries, books, countless magazine stories, newspaper articles about what happened, the whole scope of it. So let me start with you, Frank. What was the point of doing this?
You know, I think, first, I mean, most importantly, I think, Will, you'd agree with me, it's an important story to tell. I had done 20 years ago what I think was probably the first treatment documentary film ever done on Pat Tillman. My friend and former boss, Mary Jo Kinzer, is here tonight. And
Westport's own.
That's right. And we were working on what was then the Sports Century project at ESPN Classic, and we just broken into the HD sphere. And that was assigned to me. And so we worked on it. And as I recall, the fratricide news, Mary Jo, I believe that's what happened, was breaking when we were filming. So we did that without the family's involvement. So the story had always been very close to my heart. And as 20 years came up, and I know, I'll segue to Willie here. Willie, I know you led with Mike Fish and John Barr, extensive reporting about what actually happened, whereas ours, with Sports Century, was a catch-all documentary. Willie had started to pursue the story.
Right, and Willie, you did treatments for Outside the Lines at least on 2 previous occasions, and they were groundbreaking, telling this story. But this was different, and an essential element of this, of course, was the opportunity to talk to so many of the people, including Danny Tillman and Pat's fellow Rangers who were there that day. And we were able to do that because of Willie's relationship with them.
So to give a little bit of the background more specifically, in 2006, my colleague Mike Fish wrote a groundbreaking investigative series for ESPN.com, and I was assigned to work with Mike to do a television companion to his written efforts, and I was assigned to interview about half a dozen of Pat Tillman's platoon mates, and those were the first on-camera interviews that anybody had done with the platoon mates. So that was 18 years ago, it's hard to believe. And then in 2014, Mike and I again worked on a project where Stephen Elliott and Brian O'Neill, 2 of the platoon mates in this documentary, who had not spoken on camera in 2006, agreed to do interviews. And they were at opposite ends of the firefight, as you heard. Stephen Elliott was among the people shooting, and Brian O'Neill was being shot at. And it was a very emotional, powerful project. And then a year ago or so, more than a year ago, Frank and I separately had ideas that for the 20th anniversary, we'd like to do something, and we didn't discuss it. And then I heard from Danny Tillman, with whom I had contact over the years, but she had never done an interview with us. And she said to me, there's a new book out by a fellow named Pete Blaber, who had investigated independently what happened. She had asked him to investigate, and she said it warrants our attention. And based on the rapport that we had over these years, she agreed to participate in what we were doing, and that led to subsequent interviews. And I would steer you, if you're interested in learning more, to the online companion piece that's out there now called The Battle Within. It's on ESPN.com. And one more thing, so I don't forget it. The gentleman at the beginning of the documentary, the photographer, Gene Lauer, his really interesting story about surviving the recent hurricane in Florida and the negative surviving. I won't give away too much. That also is online if you'd like to read more.
David, you are much younger than Willie especially, but also me and Frank. And you were just a kid when Pat Tillman died. So you have a different perspective on this. And I should just say, preface this by, there were times when I was thinking, like, we're doing too much background. People know that stuff. Let's talk about what happened in Afghanistan, what happened subsequently. And I keep being reminded, I was talking to a journalism class at Cornell last week, I think. I asked how many of them knew who Pat Tillman was. These are undergraduates, and not a single hand went up.
We had the same experience.
Yeah.
Jeremy and I spoke with a Columbia journalism class in April when we were working on this, and we polled the class, and not one person knew about.
But David, as a younger person, what did you think we needed to do to keep the story of Pat Tillman alive?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to when I first joined the piece and the first meeting I had with you guys when we started to do this, and the conversation kind of rounded around like, why are we doing this now? You started the night by saying we'd been doing that, it's been 20 years, countless books, countless stories, countless other documentaries. Why are we doing this now? What is new? What can be done to do this story justice? And through Willie and your team's great reporting, Frank's worked with this for over 20 years, Jeremy, yours as well. I think, not to say everything that was in there, but pretty much what I think the route we took was the best way to kind of hit that sweet spot. You talked about the younger, people even younger than me who don't even know who Pat Tillman was, to remind everyone that, his story and the sacrifice he made, walking away from the NFL. And then also what had happened that day without, trying to lose anyone along the way, and while also giving the fresh new reporting of all the stuff that was discovered along the way of, what happened that day. Because even those, who are well aware of the story, I don't know how many people actually know that, the details of everything that did happen that day and the fallout, because the story has been told so much around Pat and the Tillman family, and not often, or I can't tell you really at all before, have we heard from the other people there that day, and the impact on their lives.
Yeah, and I think your first question to me, Jeremy, to Willie and I, it was really important, since we're, I don't want to say experts, but as close to experts as you can get. What's new? Like, when you're pitching a story that is got an anniversary hook to it, so to speak, that was the conversation Willie and I had, and he was the one who said, hey, this guy, Pete Belieber, I'm going to send you his book. Read it, and then let's talk. And that's really how it started. And when we had subsequent pitch meetings with our bosses, first of all, it was not a hard sell. Everyone wanted to do it. But Willie and I, well, maybe a little.
I don't know if I'd agree with you on that.
But I do think, though, we were very firm in this has to be from the point of view of the guys in the platoon. Like, we have to, this is not the sports century. This is not the football life. We have, like as David pointed out, you have to have some of it. But it was very important to us to drill down, Jeremy, to your point.
Well, I
also,
think, I'm sorry.
And Danny Tillman's, the evolution in Danny Tillman's thinking was very important, and her quest all these years for truth. That was a big difference. And as I mentioned, she had not done an interview with us. And I told her from the beginning, when she contacted me in August of 2023, I said, we need you. And she thought about it and trusted, for some reason, that we would do honor to the story and be faithful to the truth. And that was really big. And her involvement led to other people wanting to be involved when we contacted them.
And I think it also can't be overstated that, Danny Tillman's journey you're talking about, from a place where she thought her son had been murdered, not by the guys in the first vehicle in the second convoy, but that his death had been orchestrated because of his political views, his views that were evolving on the war, her evolution to a point realizing that's not what happened. But it also speaks to the misinformation that's still out there about Pat Tillman's death. And of course, the genesis of so much of it is the distrust that comes from the false narrative that was first disseminated. But it's 20 years later, and if you go online, what you see are all kinds of conspiracy theories, all kinds of false accusations, and it really comes down to what Pete Guerin said. You know, there are two stories here, right? There's what happened and how they get conflated. There's what happened in Afghanistan 20 years ago, and there's the way it was handled subsequently. So, you know, making those two different elements of this story distinct from each other was also an important objective.
I want to add something about Jeremy here because he's very good at applauding others, but Jeremy immersed himself in the subject and with his usual brilliance and his rapport with people did a masterful job, as you saw with Danny Tillman and Pete Guerin. And Pete Guerin is an interview that Jeremy got, which was one of the most important interviews we did. But Danny Tillman told me after how comfortable she felt with Jeremy and how impressed with his knowledge and preparation. Jeremy read the Blaber book, as did Frank, but he also read way more than that. And there is a lot to read. And he was really ready to do this. And he has a natural curiosity. I don't mean to embarrass you, but this is Westport.
Go on, please, go on.
This is Westport, and you do live here, so I think it's important for people to know. There's nobody else that we would have liked to have done this with other than Jeremy.
Thank you. But what I was talking about, those two different stories and how, you know, they have become conflated, and people imagine because the Army did mislead the whole world about what happened after Pat Tillman died. A lot of people say, well, they must have murdered him. And how important it was to separate those two stories and get down to the most basic facts. And structuring this wasn't easy because there's so many different elements.
Yeah, I mean, David, I was going to say, like, there's two processes going on. Willie was working with another colleague of ours, Todd Robertson, who is not here tonight, on not only on the digital piece, which he mentioned, and I strongly recommend you read it. It's full of a lot more information that we couldn't get into 48 minutes of television. But, you know, so Willie's involved in both processes. David and I are with our editor, Rob LeBay, and Jeremy. We're trying to structure this as best as we can. And, I mean, I would say, you know, no process is perfect, but I would say, how did you feel about how it went and just the back and forths that we had and making sure that we got to
be honest, please.
No, that's fine. Everything right and everything in that needed to be in and what that process was like.
Yeah. So also one other person to mention, I think he's sitting over there, is Mike Johns.
Mike Johns.
Yeah.
Who,
Our supervisor.
Yes. Who.
The hammer.
Yeah. Who, I mean, was a big part of the process that you just talked about of getting this into the right space. We had talked about this a couple times and tried a couple different things, and Mike came in, and also, you know, you mentioned Gene Lauer. That was actually Mike's idea from the beginning, which was a great way to kind of differentiate this. But it, you know, it all kind of just ties back in of like the process in this and how we kind of separate the two stories while telling them at the same time, because, you know, I think, you know, as Pete Guerin said, like those are two very different stories that are very intertwined but need to be separated because, you know, again, as Brian O'Neill said, you know, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think, you know, obviously we think it's an important story for a lot of reasons, but Pete Blaber kept coming back to, and this isn't part of what we talked about, it's important that this is dealt with honestly, and Jay touched on this earlier in the introduction, so that these mistakes aren't repeated. And that's what's so fundamentally important about honest assessments of a friendly fire death. And if everybody, and many did, you know, clammed up or order others not to speak about it, then no lessons would be learned and further lives would be lost. And that's why there were so many investigations, and that's why Danny Tillman was so relentless, not just about the memory of her oldest child, her son Pat, but because she didn't want him to have died in vain. And, you know, one of the things that I think really motivated us as well, with all this misinformation, with all of those lies that were told, with all of the conspiracies that people traffic in out there, the real heroic nature of what Pat Tillman was doing is often lost.
Yeah.
He saved Brian O'Neill's life, and you heard Brian O'Neill's emotional answers in that documentary, and there's more in the online piece. And to a person, man or woman, people who have analyzed the situation will all say that Pat Tillman acted in heroic fashion, deserved the honor, and yet to this day, the Silver Star says what it said when it was originally issued. It has not been corrected, changed in any way.
Which is strange. Yeah.
It is strange.
Yeah, it's strange. Yeah. We have time for some questions now, and we've got a microphone set up over there by the backdrop.
Yep, if you come up here.
Alex is. Anybody have any questions for us?
Don't be
And
scared.
I should also say, in the back, standing there, he's kind of silhouetted against the light back there, very heroically himself, our executive producer, Andy Tennant. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for letting us do this. You know, this is the work that we are passionate about, but it's a lot of resources, and ESPN is one of the few places that does this kind of work. So,
And thanks to Alex and the whole team involved in putting this on.
Thank you. Yes, Mary Jo.
I have a question. How's Kevin Tillman, and why was he not represented in the film?
That's a good question
That's a
for
great.
Frank.
I knew you'd come with a great question. No, that's a great question. Kevin Tillman, as I've said, these guys have heard me say it a million times, was my white whale. I wanted to interview him for 20 years, and I really thought we had a chance. The short answer is, he just doesn't do any media. What you saw, or what he has done, excuse me, he did appear at the congressional hearings, but he's never done any interview for any of the productions done on him. I thought we had a chance this time because one of his best friends is Doug Tamaro, who appeared in the first segment. He's the media liaison at Arizona State. They're very close. He gave me Kevin's number. I reached out to Kevin, and through Doug, he said very politely, hey, tell Frank, I appreciate the request. Thank you for doing the story, but I still am not ready to talk on or off the record. So Mary Jo, we tried, as you know we would try, but and at the end of the day, we decided not to put anything of him in there because we didn't want to, I guess, make it seem like, we didn't get him, but he was very much on our minds. And one other note, his younger brother, Richard, is not doing well. He suffers from, he had a schizophrenic break a few years ago. Danny told us that when we talked. It's really sad, but Kevin has 2 children. She's a very active grandma, and she's in the process of moving to Arizona to be closer to Kevin and his family.
But Kevin did see the documentary.
He did see it. Yeah, and he approved of it, so that was good.
And if you don't know, Kevin was a professional athlete himself. He was a minor league baseball player in the Cleveland system, right?
I believe so. Yeah, he was.
And
yeah.
when the guy said that he approved it, he didn't get to see it before it aired. He saw it after it aired.
Thank you. Yeah.
And his mother said that he told her that he thought it was strong. And the other thing about Kevin that I think is really important to share is he's been consistent all the way through.
Yeah.
As Frank mentioned, it's not like he's picked and chosen opportunities to be out there. He has kept a very private, low profile.
Yes, sir.
I may have missed a couple of things, but maybe you can provide a little more detail on why. 2 questions. Why was Pat up on the ridge? Why did he leave the Humvee? First question. Second question is what's the explanation for separating the Humvees into 2 groups?
So I'll try to do this as concisely as possible, and if I get something wrong, let me know. So they split the platoon into 2 convoys because they wanted to achieve 2 objectives that day. They wanted to get the disabled Humvee to what they call a hardball road, where it could be picked up by a wrecker and taken back, I think, to FOB Salerno. So that was the second convoy. with the Jenga truck, which was the local truck that was rented. And at the same time, the orders came down from Salerno that they wanted the first half, the first convoy, the other half of the platoon, to continue the mission it was already out in the field to accomplish, which was checking these grids for enemy fighters, weapons caches, et cetera. And they were going to get to the town of Mana before sundown to begin that process. I think that's as simple as it gets, right? Yeah. And then, I'm sorry, the other question was about why Pat Tillman. Yeah. So what happened basically was, you know, the tactical, what do they call it? The tactical side of the hill where there was cover, when they heard the second convoy being ambushed, that's where the first half of the platoon was kind of huddled together. And Pat decided he wanted to be able to direct fire, provide cover for those guys. So he went over asking permission from his squad leader. And he and Brian O'Neill, as he said, followed him. And Syed Farhad went with them.
He went with them, that's right.
Yeah. That's what we know. Yes.
Hi. So Pat and his brother were in the same platoon?
Correct.
Is that unusual to have siblings in the same?
I don't know. I mean, you would think that it might be discouraged, but it was specifically a condition of their enlistment.
And just to clarify and reiterate, they were in the same platoon, but as the events unfolded, they were in the different convoys. So Pat was in the first, Kevin was in the second, but he was far toward the back, so he didn't see what happened. And somebody had to break the news to him that he had lost his brother, and then they didn't tell him what had happened to cause his death.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Your closing comments was that you estimated that there was approximately 138 additional friendly fire deaths. My question is, was there any cover-up with them? And question number two is, if he wasn't a celebrity who gave up a lucrative NFL career, would be even doing this documentary now?
No, we wouldn't be doing it at ESPN because we're doing it, you know, we've always done stories about Pat Tillman because of his connection to sports.
I want to add one more thing on that topic, though. Beyond the question of whether we would have done something is the question, what would have been done about his death in terms of investigations? And I think it's important to note that one of the generals that I interviewed and my colleague interviewed said that were it not for the fact that his mother kept pushing and pushing, there would not have been all the investigations there were, and were it not for his celebrity, there would not have been nearly the number of investigations there were.
And that's a fair question about the other friendly fire deaths. I simply don't know. I don't know if anyone knows exactly, you know, what happened in each of those situations. I think what we do know, according to those numbers, it was many fewer friendly fire deaths than the U.S. Army recorded in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Those are the numbers they gave us. Yeah. And that are out there publicly.
One more thing also, that this is in the written piece, not in the television piece, but Pat Tillman's death did lead to some change in the way friendly fire episodes are reported to family members. So there were regulations on the books, and they were not followed to a T, not nearly to a T, in the case of Pat Tillman, but those regulations were reinforced after his death to try to further prevent such lack of communication to the next of kin.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey there, Alex Pierce. I just wanted to say, first and foremost, the piece came out incredibly. Truly heartbreaking, truly angering and upsetting all around as to what happened. As far as my question's concerned, I had it written down. Can you share any memorable feedback that you might have gotten from Pat's family, the military, anyone else that you might have shown this to?
Sure. So there are two things. We, in the morning, released the online piece, 6,000 words, multimedia, and that night came the television documentary. And we've heard from Pete Blaber, Danny Tillman, Stephen Elliott, Eric Godick, Brian O'Neill. I haven't heard from Don Lee yet.
No, we haven't heard from Don. But
Or Annette Hill. But all of them, either immediately or after a while, gave very favorable feedback. And to me, probably the most uplifting was to hear from Brian O'Neill, because I've now known him for over 10 years. I worked with him on the 2014 project that we did and renewed the acquaintance for this one, and he thanked us for getting it right.
And one thing to note about Brian O'Neill, you might think after that experience he would have left the Army, but instead he is still in the Army, and he is in E9, the highest enlisted rank. He's a command sergeant major.
And he's due to retire in 2025. I'm giving away some of the stuff in the text story,
Right.
which I don't want to do because I hope you'll read it. But I do want to give you one more behind-the-scenes note. I mentioned Eric Godick. Eric Godick also wrote us a beautiful note, and you saw his emotions. We did that interview with him by Zoom. He is in Dubai. And the day that we did the interview, Jeremy from his home in Westport, Frank was in Bristol, Connecticut, I was at my apartment in Manhattan, was the day of the earthquake in this area in April.
Yeah, he saw all of us like, what's going on? He's like, what's going on there?
yeah,
It was wild because late in the interview, and it was probably about a 2-hour interview, I'd say about an hour and 40 minutes into it, I'm feeling our apartment shake, and I'm looking at Jeremy, and I see he's looking around like something's going on here. And so Eric Godick was in the middle of an answer, and at the end of the answer, I said, Eric, in case you're wondering what's going on, we're having an earthquake.
The other thing I will add too, Danny Tillman has since spoken with a lot of these guys. I remember she and Eric spoke for the first time, right, Willie, after we did the interview with Eric, we connected the two of them. And, you know, Don Lee has spoken to her, and they both, to a man, have said how that's helped them to heal. Eric, as you saw in the film, is still very moved by it all. Willie and I've developed quite a relationship with Danny myself in a short period of time, and I spoke with her for about an hour the next day afterwards. And, you know, Willie will tell you, she's everything that you see in this film. She's one of the, I mean, the greatest people you'll ever meet in your life, principled, disciplined, will tell you exactly what she thinks, and is just very real, and you can see where Pat got a lot of it from. Like, you could definitely see that connection.
And incidentally, Pete Guerin, the former Secretary of the Army, he said that he never reads or watches anything that includes him. So fair.
But you might add, Jeremy, your conduit to Pete Guerin, what he's...
I don't know if he wants the world to know he was the conduit, but
You
yes.
don't have to use his name.
No, that's right. Yeah, he thought he thought the treatment was fair and well done.
And he said he would tell Pete Guerin that.
Yes. Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind if I asked a quick follow-up question,
sure.
more of a technical question. With the advent of Zoom and the popularization of it throughout the pandemic, how do you feel about that being used more and more in documentary storytelling?
Dave, you want to take that one?
We'll let the kid on the crew.
Yeah.
Well, it is a discussion that we did have for this one, exactly as you saw, Brian. So we did you did the interview with Godick via Zoom, but there was a camera crew there. You were back in Bristol. The Brian O'Neill interview, which was done strictly over Zoom, there was a kind of a back and forth about, do we use it? Do we not use it? And we pretty much came to the conclusion that with the content matter being so strong, and kind of to your point, the bit of normalization of it having been in everything post-2020, we had made the decision to include it, mostly you know, the content stood out for itself, and Brian's account of everything was vital to the story.
And Willie was, we give Willie full credit here because he immediately contacted Brian, said, I'm just going to do this interview with him. He was on a base. We obviously couldn't hire a crew to get to him. And within 10 minutes, let us know this is really, really good. And so to Dave's point, we talked with Mike Johns, our leader, and he was like, yeah, use it.
O'Neill is in Italy right now. That's where he's serving. And I'd like to think that substance wins, and that's the bottom line. I will say this, throughout this project and many others over the last 4 years, Zoom has been an incredible tool, and not just what you see on television. I can't tell you how many interviews for the online piece were done by Zoom. My colleague and I did some together. I did some by myself. He did some by himself. But Zoom is amazing. And I had never heard of it before. I'll be honest with you. I'm an old guy and old-fashioned. I knew nothing about Zoom before the pandemic, and now it's one of my best friends.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I mean, as long as I've been in business, 30 plus years, we've always done remote interviews like that where there wasn't Zoom technology, but you would be on a speakerphone with someone in another place where there might be a camera set up. But Zoom has made it more mainstream, and we do it much more frequently now that there's also the video element where you can see the person.
Well, and then the other thing is how it looks. That's the important thing. It doesn't look as good as when you have a camera crew, and that's to your point about the technical. It's never going to be, with the current technology, as nice looking as having a high quality camera crew present. And so that goes to Dave's point. It looks a little bit different than the other interviews, but I think ultimately the decision is it's not jarring to the audience to see that. So we're used to it, whether you're watching the network news on a daily basis or a whole host of shows, people accept it. It's a little bit different, but it's, as Jeremy said, part of the mainstream now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Hi.
Hi.
It's my understanding from reading John Krakauer's book that Pat wrote a pretty extensive diary that the military burned. Is that true? I've seen two documentaries nobody mentioned.
So Krakauer had access to significant portions of his diaries from before he went
Yeah, that's right.
overseas, correct? And,
Yeah.
and then the journal that he was keeping at the time of his death was burned.
Yeah.
And other things happened, which Danny mentioned or alluded to. They burned his uniform afterwards. That was against policy. There were a lot of things that happened. We don't get into all the details. It's too far down the rabbit hole, but there were statements for the Silver Star citation, which were signed by
O'Neill and Ward.
One of them says he never said this stuff. The other one says he didn't sign it. It was altered. I might have it a little bit off. So yeah, there was a lot of suspicious stuff that happened.
Do they know who ordered the burning of his diary?
I'm sorry?
Who ordered the burning of his diary?
So it's interesting. One of the lines I think we had, it's hard for me to separate what we had up until the day of publication and what actually made it in, because there's a whole frenzy to get to the finish line. But it's that to this day, there are so many questions that are still out there about the roles of different people and what exactly happened. And I think that one of the things we didn't mention is we did not strive to be comprehensive, because that's impossible. We strive to give as much of the story as we felt we could and to shed as much new light as we could. It's really a challenge. And even when you're with the best of people and have the greatest of cooperation, it's really a bear. What we hope to do is to inspire additional inquiry and also to give people a sense not only of what happened then, but what might happen and what needs to be avoided, as Jeremy mentioned earlier.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just got time for one more.
Okay.
You mentioned it very briefly, but the just the lack of accountability that is with leadership. It just, I mean, you like fleetingly went over that, but it just seems just so egregious. And the fact that his companions or his fellow the people in his
Platoon mates.
thank you feel such guilt and there's no accountability from anybody at the top. And how do these people just get away with it?
Well, we tried to interview several of those people, and no one would talk to us. And, as we said, there were no serious repercussions for most of the people in the chain of command. Many of them went on to very celebrated careers in the military. That's why we all thought it was important to get someone from the Army High Command to talk to us, and Pete Guerin, who was the Secretary of the Army, not at the time that Pat Tillman died, but subsequently when these investigations, some of them were taking place, were wrapping up, talked to us. But those are good questions. We said Lieutenant General Kinzinger was the only one who was publicly censured, and he was already retired.
That I would say, Dave, that we spent, and Willie too, I know, with you and Todd as well, a significant amount of time in that section. Because you're right, it is very important. There's a lot of information to get in.
I should say, we did an earlier piece that appeared 6 months ago
on the
anniversary of Pat Tillman's death. And that story specifically, it was shorter, it was on SportsCenter, it was about 8-9 minutes long, and that story specifically focused on our Danny Tillman interview and some of the things that she said, including her disappointment, which is a ridiculous understatement, with General McChrystal. And so that was more specifically about General McChrystal, Danny Tillman's feelings about the lack of accountability. That story aired in April and received some national pickup.
And that's
They
still
have no
online if you're
honor, though,
interested. If
you
you're
know?
interested in seeing that, both the video and the accompanying text piece, that's still online as well.
What is it again? It's called.
If you were to Google
Just
Pat
Google it.
Tillman, ESPN.com,
Yeah.
and
It's just such
our
a
names,
glaring lack of honor.
Well, that was the thing. It's like Pat is someone, Dave and I talked about this a lot. He was someone, one of the questions you get a lot is, well, why did he do it? Was it as cut and dried as it was? And that really was the case. I mean, he just, and I'm drawing on my years of experience from all the people that I interviewed, even as far back as 20 years ago, people like Jake Plummer and Zach Walls and Dave McGinnis, they were very blunt and said, this is who Pat is. He makes up his mind, he does it. And that's, so for someone who held everyone, including himself, to such a high standard, the real tragedy, at least for me, was seeing how the Army, to your point, how there's the lack of accountability. Jeff Bailey, who we mentioned we tried to get a hold of him, nobody seems to know where he is. So it's really sad. Dave, I don't know how you feel about it. Feel the same way.
Yeah, no, I think, his mom, Danny, had a good bite in there and talks about, why is she doing this and why you're being so relentless? And it's, well, because Pat would be. That's who Pat was.
Yeah.
And, the decisions Pat made, I forget the other gentleman who asked, would we be covering this if Pat wasn't, an athlete? Would we be? Probably not. But, Pat's not the only person who decided to join after 9/11, but he, walked away from what he walked away from, and then to be treated as such, after death.
And Danny was very quick to point out, I think it was in the April, it wasn't just Pat who suffered, it's all the other families who lost sons and daughters who suffered as well.
Dave Seronick, Willie Weinbaum, Frank Saraceno. Guys, thank you very
Jeremy
much.
Schaap.
Thank you. And thank you guys. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.